G'day viewer, welcome back to another one of my little adventures. This time I'm going to take a few days, travel along this road. It starts right here in this picturesque little town of Gloucester, right at the base of the Barrington Tops. It's not a long road, it's only 290 kilometres. It starts right here in Gloucester, up and across the Barrington Tops, all the way up to almost to Inverell, about 100 kilometres short of the Queensland border. As I say, it's not a very long road, but it's very, very pretty, and there's quite a few interesting spots to check out along the way. So, let's go. Thunderbolts Way.
Dark horse, renegade, vigilante, got it made. Rebel heart, underdog, play the part. They call me an outlaw. Whoa, whoa, living like an outlaw. Whoa, whoa, they call me an outlaw.
So I guess I should explain why this road is called Thunderbolts Way. It's named after a bushranger who roamed these parts back in the 1860s, in the pioneering days of Australia. He didn't always spend his time up here in the mountains. His area of, let's say, infamy stretches from Maitland all the way up to the Queensland border, up past Inverell and out west to Burke. So he travelled quite a long way, and he took a lot of time in between his robberies. He was known as a gentleman bushranger because he never actually killed anybody. He did shoot at police, never shot at any civilians, but he did rob a lot of them. He was the longest reigning bushranger in Australian history, nearly 7 years. He was actually born Frederick Wordsworth Ward, which sounds a bit aristocratic for the son of a convict, but that's what he was. Sent out to work at 11, became a fantastic horseman, cattleman, but once he got onto a life of crime, there was no turning back. There's a lot of myths and legends about how he got the name Captain Thunderbolt, but the actual true story is that when he held up the toll booth in Rutherford, and as he was leaving, he called out to the people he'd just robbed, "I am Thunderbolt." So it's self-proclaimed, and that's where the name came from. Of course, there was no roads as flash as this back in Thunderbolt's day. This area would have been just virgin bush. There might have been a bit of a track, bit of an Aboriginal track that the early pioneers used to follow, maybe a man on horseback, the odd bullock dray. This version of the road, with the bitumen and the lines and the signs, wasn't even completed till 1961. Thunderbolt was here 100 years before that. You look at how rugged these mountains are, and you wonder how anybody used to survive just getting around here.
At 76,500 hectares, and with its highest point at over 1,500 metres, this is, still today for the most part, a massive rugged wilderness. A number of aeroplanes have come fatally unstuck around these parts, and search and rescue missions have often been stifled by the terrain. One of those planes, VH MDX, a Cessna 210, which departed from the Whitsundays in Queensland in August 1981 and en route to Sydney, was last heard of when the pilot reported excessive turbulence and downdraft, and that the aircraft's artificial horizon and gyroscope direction indicator had failed. That aircraft and the 5 men on board have never been found despite various well-funded official and private search operations.
And Thunderbolt wasn't the only criminal to make his way up here. A modern-day bushranger by the name of Malcolm Naden.
He made these mountains home for around 2 years between 2010 and 2012, before the law finally caught up with him. He'd been on the run since 2005, when he was accused of murdering 2 young girls out near Dubbo. And during the next 7 years, he perpetrated a number of other crimes, not least of which was shooting and wounding a Special Operations police officer when he got a bit too close to one of Naden's bush hideouts.
Anyway, Malcolm lived up here and gave the police a right royal chase. He was one of Australia's most wanted criminals there for a while. And he survived up here for all that time with his local bushcraft. And there's a lot of houses up here where people only come up every now and again, you know, weekenders, holiday homes. So there's food in the fridge, there's food in the cupboards, you could break in and spend a few days in there. There's a few close calls when the police were chasing him. There was a few close calls where they nearly got him, but they'd go in the front door and he'd be out the back window. Anyway, this was his home. It's a beautiful top spot, it's great.
Back in 1856, Fred Ward was working at Tocal near Maitland when he decided to join his nephew, John Garbutt, who was the ringleader of a large horse and cattle stealing operation. Together with a few other men, they drove around 4 dozen stolen horses from various properties around the Maitland district down to Windsor, where they were sold at auction. He and 2 nephews were convicted and sent to Cockatoo Island for 10 years hard labour. Ward's first claim to infamy was as one of only 2 men to ever escape from the brutally notorious prison on Cockatoo Island in Sydney Harbour. He and his co-conspirator, Frederick Britton, swam to freedom after absconding from a work gang on September 11, 1863. After Gloucester, heading north, the first town of any size is Walker. And just outside Walker is the awesome Apsley Gorge and its accompanying waterfall. This is Thunderbolts Rock, just outside of Uralla. It sits on a slight rise with a good view in all directions, especially up and down the road which passes by. That road, today, is named the New England Highway, but in the 1860s it was called the Great Northern Road, and it ran from Sydney through the Hunter Valley and right up into Queensland. It's important to note this place in Thunderbolt's story, because this is a place that marks both the beginning and the end of his notorious career. After he and Britton had escaped from Cockatoo Island, they were waiting to ambush the mail coach here when they were spotted behind the rock by a couple of escorting troopers, and in the resultant gunfight, Ward was shot in the back of the left knee. They escaped that skirmish, and the duo parted ways. Ward went on to become Thunderbolt, while Britton was never heard of again. Just north of Uralla lies the Mount Yarrawick Nature Reserve. After parking in the allotted area near the main road and taking a fairly flat walk through natural bushland peppered with granite outcrops, the well-used track leads up a hill to a shallow cave. The back wall of the cave is covered in ancient red ochre artworks that are said to be at least a few hundred years old. Thunderbolts Way comes to an end about 12 kilometres short of the New England town of Inverell, where it crosses Capes Creek. And Capes Creek is one of the many surrounding waterways which contribute to the nearby Captain Dam, so I reckon that whilst in the area I may as well make a detour in that direction. But along the way there was one other place I'd always wanted to visit. I'm doing the Myall Creek Memorial Walk. This place has been set up in remembrance of the 28 Wurray people who were murdered at this site on June 10, 1838. Basically back then in 1838 they liked their sport just as much as we do these days. Trouble was, the sport they liked back then was murdering the local indigenous population. 28, mainly women, children and old people. In those days, hunting involved a group of Europeans, and in this case they were all convicts or ex-convicts, who came out here and they rounded them all up, rounded up the Aboriginal people who were camped by the creek, which is just down here, took them all down there, tied them up, and using swords they decapitated most of them. I think there was 2 that were shot, but most of them were decapitated. It's a terrible story. There's a lot more involved than what I've put down here. Look it up. Every Australian should know this part of our history. What makes this story a little bit different was that all 11 of those people, all 11 of those murderers, were eventually rounded up, and on the evidence of some of the people who refused to go with them, other stockmen that worked out here, they were all taken to Sydney, tried and convicted and hung. Well, most of them were hung. I think there were 7 that were hung. The others were charged with being accessories. It's a terrible story, look it up. Just called into Bingra. Got some pies. Oh geez, they're hot. So, needed somewhere for a picnic. What better spot than the Gwyder River? How peaceful and tranquil is that? Homemade pies. This is a free camping zone around here, and there's plenty of places along this river where you can go camping. From Bingra, heading along Captain Dam Road. Going to go out the dam and check that out. But this will do for lunch. Wow, that's a nice pie. That's beautiful. It's got tomato, bacon, beef, onion. What more could you want? This footage is from when we camped at Captain Dam in 2009. The water level at that time, in the middle of a big drought, was down to 10%. But this time around, the level is at 99.4%.
Mate, the water was 200 yards from here last time we were here. Hello. You a tame looking thing? Couldn't care less.
Almost 7 years after Fred Ward escaped Cockatoo Island and became Thunderbolt, he was back at the Split Rock outside of Uralla, plying his trade by waylaying passers-by on the Great Northern Road. Later in the day, he bailed up patrons at the Royal Oak Inn at nearby Church Gully. As was his habit, he kept patrons holed up at the establishment while he plied them and himself with alcohol. One of the townsfolk slipped away and immediately headed to Uralla for help. When two troopers duly arrived later in the day, Ward was in the process of drunkenly test riding a horse offered for sale by one of the bailed up patrons. As he was always mounted on stolen racehorses, he was easily able to outrun any local policeman who might decide to give chase. But this time around, as the policeman approached, he took off on the nag he was already astride, and so one of the policemen, Constable Alexander Walker, was able to catch up and fatally wound the horse when it stumbled in the soft earth near Kentucky Creek. On foot, wading through waist-deep water and firing over his shoulder, Ward was hampered enough that the mounted policeman was able to take aim and bring his life of crime to a fateful conclusion.
Erected by New England residents to mark where lies Thunderbolt, Fred Ward.
I reckon Fred Ward would be highly amused to know that there's a road named after him. He'd probably also find it quite funny to know that the residents of Uralla and surrounding districts had all chipped in to buy a headstone for him, and that they maintain and upkeep his gravesite. These days it's only tourists who get parted from their cash along this road, but I guess that's only fair. After all, this is Thunderbolts Way.